Welcome back to Reformed Thinking. Today we're really going to dig into a section of Matthew's Gospel that, well, it's incredibly clever structurally and just packed theologically. We're focusing on Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, and how it functions as this crucial programmatic summary, kind of the key, really, that unlocks the whole central part of the Gospel, running from chapter 5 all the way through to chapter 9, verse 35.
Yeah, it's easy to sort of read Matthew and think, okay, chapters 5 to 7, that's the Sermon on the Mount, that's all teaching, and then chapters 8 and 9, oh, those are the miracles, that's all action. But if you separate them like that, you actually miss Matthew's careful design. He really doesn't want you to read them in isolation.
Right. So that opening statement in 4.23 isn't just, moving the story along. It's this incredibly concise summary. It's like Matthew's telling you, the reader, right up front, how this king, Jesus, plans to operate, how he'll show his authority and bring in his reign.
And our goal today really is to get a handle on why Matthew so intentionally weaves together Christ's teaching, what we're calling the word, and his miracles, what we'll call the deed. Getting this connection is, well, it's essential because it defines Jesus not just as, say, a great ethical teacher or maybe just a miracle worker. No, it shows him as the authoritative king, the one who speaks with this unmatched right, this prerogative, and who acts with just incredible compassion. We need both, don't we? We need the light from his teaching, and we need the mercy shown in his touch to really grasp who he is as king.
Okay, so the material we're looking at today really focuses on a few key things. There's this specific threefold pattern of ministry Jesus consistently uses. Then there's this structural frame, like a literary hinge, holding the narrative block together. We'll also look at the crowds, who they were, where they came from, which is surprisingly diverse. And maybe most critically, for understanding Matthew's point, we need to look at the order he chooses. He puts the doctrine, the teaching, before the big displays of divine power. And that order, well, it tells us something about where our focus should be as followers.
All right, let's start by unpacking that core definition of Jesus' regular public work laid out right there in Matthew 4.23. Our sources really stress that this verse isn't describing like a one-off event. It's summing up this steady, continuous rhythm of Jesus' ministry day to day.
That's exactly right. When Matthew describes what Jesus was doing across Galilee, he uses three present participles in the Greek text. And grammatically, that usage points to ongoing customary action. This wasn't just something Jesus did now and then. This was his ministry pattern. This was the constant beat of his work. Okay, so what are those three verbs? What defines that pattern?
Well, first there's teaching. That's didasken in Greek. This points to his systematic instruction, often happening in places like the synagogues, where he'd open up the scriptures and explain them.
Okay, teaching. What's next?
Second is heralding. The Greek is kerishon. Now, this is different from teaching. This is about authoritative public proclamation. Think of a royal announcement.
Got it. Instruction, then proclamation. And the third?
The third is healing, therapeution. This covers his actions of mercy, restoring people from, well, every kind of sickness and affliction they were suffering under.
So teaching, proclaiming, and restoring, all happening together constantly. But why does Matthew put so much structural emphasis on this specific trio?
Because Matthew is being a very careful writer here, a real architect. And the genius, structurally, is that this exact triad teaching, heralding, healing, doesn't just show up once in 4.23. It comes back word for word in chapter 9, verse 35. It says, Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction.
Wow, okay, so that repetition, that bookending, that's clearly deliberate. It creates this frame, doesn't it, for everything that happens between chapter 4 and chapter 9, like a literary hinge telling you how to read this whole central block.
Exactly. Think of it like Matthew's giving you the blueprint for this section. He's saying, look, in these next 5 chapters, I'm going to show you what this triad teaching, heralding, healing actually looks like when Jesus does it. This frame gives you the context you need to interpret what follows.
And that frame seems to signal a really clear division within chapters 5 through 9. It sort of forces us to see two connected movements.
Precisely. The first big movement is what we can call the King's Words. That's chapters 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And notice, the word comes first in the frame teaching and heralding. So Matthew presents the king's primary activity as instruction. Here you get the doctrine, the royal law, the ethical shape of the kingdom.
Okay, the king speaks first. And then right after that massive block of teaching, we shift gears, right, into the second movement.
Yes, the king's deeds, that's chapters 8 and 9. This shows the king in action. He demonstrates his authority and his compassion through this carefully selected sequence of 10 miracles. And this part really showcases the healing element from that initial triad.
So the flow is intentional. Word, then deed. Chapters 5 to 7 are dense, demanding teaching. Chapters 8 to 9 are fast-paced, dramatic displays of power and mercy.
Right, and the crucial insight, the reason Matthew structures it this way isn't just to report events chronologically, it's about how these two parts illuminate each other.
How so?
The structure shows that the words interpret the works, and the works authenticate the words. Matthew won't let you pull these two aspects of Jesus' ministry apart.
Ah, I see. So the words, like those really tough demands in the sermon, they might seem idealistic, maybe even impossible if you didn't have the deeds right after, showing his divine authority.
Exactly. And conversely, the deeds, the healings, the miracles, they could be mistaken for just, impressive magic tricks or spectacle if they weren't tied directly to the kingly teaching that explains their purpose and the identity of the one doing them.
So chapters 5 through 7 give the theological meaning to the power he wields in chapters 8 and 9. And then chapters 8 and 9 prove that the person who spoke the sermon actually has the divine right, the authority, to make those kinds of demands.
It's a confirmation of his rule. The instruction, the standard for his people, comes first. And then it's validated by the demonstration of his sovereign power. That order really directs our attention, doesn't it? It tells his subjects. Listen to the king's voice first and foremost.
Okay, let's drill down on that detail. Teaching, didasken, is listed first. It comes before the heralding, before the healing. Now, from our perspective, emphasizing Reformed theology and the high view of Scripture, what does putting teaching first tell us about Christ's priorities in his ministry?
Well, it clearly signals the primacy of doctrine. Doctrine comes first because the king chooses to gather his people, his subjects, and shape them through instruction. It reminds us of that foundational principle. Faith comes by hearing. Before people can respond properly, whether in obedience or even just in awe, they need to understand. They need to grasp the nature of this kingdom he's talking about and the kind of righteousness it requires.
And where did this teaching usually happen? You mentioned synagogues earlier.
Yes, he often taught in the synagogues. Those were the established places for reading and explaining the Old Testament scriptures. But right away, he stood out. He wasn't just another teacher repeating traditions like the scribes often did, citing Rabbi so-and-so. No, Jesus opened the word with something completely different, unmatched authority. The crowds didn't just hear information. They sensed a fundamental difference in the source of the authority. Matthew highlights this later, doesn't he, when he says they were astonished at his teaching.
Yeah, that's in chapter 7. It feels like they recognized he wasn't just quoting authorities. He was the authority.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And Matthew deliberately structures the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 to 7, to underscore this claim to divine authority. Even the setting teaching on a mountain immediately makes you think of Moses receiving the law at Sinai, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It signals this is a new Sinai moment, but obviously with someone much greater than Moses.
Precisely. This king speaks with a divine prerogative that both fulfills and, in a sense, transcends the Old Covenant law. The whole sermon is punctuated by that repeated, frankly stunning phrase. You have heard that it was said to those of old, but I say to you.
That phrase, but I say to you, it's just staggering when you stop and think about it. He's not just tweaking the law or offering a new interpretation. He's speaking as the king, the ultimate lawgiver, laying down the standard with his own voice. It's a claim to divine identity, isn't it? Sovereignty over the very law he came to fulfill.
It is. He doesn't just explain the law. He intensifies it, pushing it to its deepest spiritual intent. He addresses the root, not just the action, not just murder, but the anger that leads to it, not just adultery, but the lustful thought. This shows that the Sermon on the Mount is truly the king's law for his people. It defines the character, the inner righteousness required for life in God's dawning reign. You could call it the royal charter of the Son of David.
So the sermon isn't just like a list of nice ethical suggestions for being a good person. It's covenant instruction. It describes life under the active rule of Christ himself.
Yes, covenant instruction. It makes it clear that the righteousness demanded of kingdom citizens has to go deeper than the external rule-keeping righteousness of the religious leaders of the day. The king's teaching is the living standard for his people, shaping them from the inside out.
Okay, let's shift to the second verb in that triad, heralding, karishin. How is that different from teaching, didashin? They both seem to involve speaking.
They're related, for sure, but they have distinct functions. Teaching, didasken, is more about the systematic explanation, the how and what of living righteously in the kingdom. Heralding, parishon, is about the public, authoritative announcement, more like the who and when of the kingdom's arrival. The word "keroshin" is specifically linked to the idea of a royal announcement made by an official herald.
Ah, like a town crier announcing the king's decree or arrival.
Exactly that kind of official public declaration. It's spoken with the delegated authority of the king himself. The herald's job is to bring the immediate news concerning the reign.
And what was the content of that heralded message?
It was the declaration that God's saving rule, his Basileia or kingdom, had arrived. It was drawing near in the person and the work of Jesus the Messiah. Remember, Matthew already summarized Jesus' initial proclamation back in 4.17. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The heralding is the public announcement that this long-promised reign of God is no longer just future hope. It's breaking into the present. The king is here, his rule is active, and it demands a response: repentance and submission.
So, by putting both teaching the detailed instruction and heralding the royal announcement before the deeds, Matthew makes sure we understand the doctrine first. It's authoritative covenant law from the Son of David himself. It grounds all those ethical demands of the sermon in who Jesus actually is.
Right. If you try to take away the royal announcement, the teaching just becomes abstract ethics, maybe even a list of impossible ideals. But Matthew's structure forces you to hear the sermon not as good advice, but as law proclaimed by the true sovereign, the one who has the right to command.
Okay, now we get to the works, the deed part of the equation. The third verb, healing, erapium. If the word is about doctrine and royal proclamation, what do the healing acts functionally show us about Christ's kingship?
Well, the deeds, the healings especially, function like enacted sermons. They're visible, tangible signs of the kingdom. They publicly display the reality of that royal reign that Jesus just announced through his preaching. The word declared the reign. The deeds confirm it's actually here and operating. The healings show Christ's sovereign rule over the effects of the fall over sickness, corruption, even over demonic powers. It's the king exercising his right to reverse the curse.
You mentioned earlier that Matthew uses that double every in 4.23 to stress how complete his healing was.
Yes. That phrase, pasan nosan kai pasan malachian, every disease and every affliction, it's a rhetorical way to emphasize comprehensiveness. And it reveals something beautiful. This is power joined to pity. Supreme authority coupled with a deep compassion. Jesus meets the entire range of human suffering. Chronic illness, debilitating weakness, sudden agonizing pain. It doesn't matter. The king isn't limited. His power and mercy are sufficient for the whole spectrum of human misery.
And this brings us to that specific list of sufferers Matthew gives in verse 24. It's not just a general statement. He names distinct categories. Why is that detailed list, that taxonomy, so significant?
Matthew's being very precise here, and it matters. He's showing that Jesus addresses different kinds of ruin that resulted from the fall. The list includes:
First, the demonized daimonis omnis.
Right. This represents the reality of moral spiritual tyranny. Direct, hostile spiritual oppression and bondage. It's not just sickness, it's spiritual warfare.
Okay. Second, the seizure sufferers, Solenanias omnis. This is sometimes translated lunatics, possibly referring to epilepsy or severe mental and neurological disorders.
That seems likely. This category covers afflictions affecting the mind and nerves, things that cause dramatic physical or behavioral issues. But notice, Matthew carefully distinguishes this from direct demonization.
That is an interesting distinction. And third,
the paralytics, paralyticus, conditions that rob people of movement, of strength in their limbs, leaving them helpless.
so he could have just said he healed everyone. But by listing these three types, spiritual oppression, mental nervous system issues, and physical paralysis, what's the theological point Matthew's driving home?
He's making a really crucial pastoral point, actually. It guards against two potential errors. First, Matthew refuses to lump every problem under a spiritual cause. This protects against superstition or wrongly blaming someone's faith for a physical ailment. But second, and just as critical, he refuses to reduce spiritual bondage to mere physiology or psychology. This guards against a kind of modern reductionism that denies the reality of the demonic. Jesus addresses the whole person, the spiritual conflict, the broken body, the disordered mind. And the key takeaway, for every single one of these distinct categories, Matthew's summary is simple, and he healed them. No condition, no matter its source or severity, proves resistant to his command. His authority is absolute across the board.
That distinction has huge implications for how the church should approach suffering today, doesn't it? Recognizing the different facets of human brokenness.
It absolutely does. We need wisdom to see that some situations call for prayer for deliverance from spiritual attack. Others need competent medical care for the body or mind. Still others need therapy or rest. The king's power ultimately covers restoration in all these areas, even if his chosen means vary.
And Matthew describing these healings, the lame walking, the sick restored, that connects directly back to Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, right?
Oh, definitely. This list of healings aligns perfectly with Isaianic expectations. These aren't just random acts of kindness. They are enacted prophecies. They serve as Jesus' credentials, showing he is the awaited Messiah. They signal the promised age has begun. Remember Isaiah 35? Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer. Jesus is doing the very things the prophets said the Messiah would do.
He's providing tangible proof that he is who he claims to be.
Exactly. And Matthew takes it even deeper. In chapter 8, verse 17, he explicitly interprets this healing ministry through the lens of the suffering servant, quoting Isaiah 53:4. Matthew says Jesus healed people so that the prophecy might be fulfilled. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases.
Now that's a fascinating connection. How does healing someone's temporary sickness in Galilee relate to bearing their diseases, which we usually associate with the cross?
It shows the profound depth of the king's compassion and the substitutionary nature of his work, even in these early acts. Matthew is suggesting that when Jesus relieved these burdens, casting out demons, restoring strength, taking away pain, he was already, in a sense, entering into the reality of human suffering. He was demonstrating the principle of substitutionary burden-bearing. Every healing was a pointer towards the ultimate healing needed forgiveness of sin and reconciliation with God, accomplished on the cross. The physical cures were powerful previews, foretastes of the complete restoration he came to achieve by bearing our ultimate disease, sin itself.
So the deeds don't just show kingly power, but kingly compassion and substitutionary identification with our plight. They confirm he has both the authority and the heart to deal with every kind of misery.
Yes, they have the public, merciful validation of the royal word he proclaimed. The one who lays down the strict demands of the sermon is the same, one who has the divine power and willingness to lift the burdens of this fallen world.
So Matthew very deliberately holds the word, chapters 5 to 7, and the deed, chapters 8 to 9, tightly together, using that 4.23 and 9.35 frame. Why is keeping this pairing intact so critical for us today? What kind of mistakes does this structure help us avoid?
Well, that intentional framing, that unity, it guards against two very common and, frankly, dangerous errors that crop up again and again in Christian life and in the church. Matthew's structure is pastorally protective.
Okay, what's the first danger?
The first is what you might call spectacle hunting. This is the mistake of following Jesus, mainly for the signs and wonders, the miracles, the immediate benefits, seeking the marvels without actually heeding his teaching or submitting your life to the king's commands.
Right, people are drawn by a need, maybe for healing or help, and they want the kingdom's benefits, but maybe not the responsibilities that come with being a citizen of that kingdom.
Precisely. They might be happy to follow Jesus all over Galilee as long as he's doing amazing things, but they might balk the radical demands of his doctrine, things like loving enemies, or the need for internal purity, not just outward conformity. Matthew anticipates this. Think about the flow. He describes the massive crowds drawn by the healings in 4.2425, and then immediately in 5.12, he shows Jesus sitting down and delivering the hard demands of discipleship to those who would truly follow.
The structure itself is a kind of challenge, isn't it? It forces the reader to shift focus from what Jesus does for your immediate needs to what he requires of your heart and life.
Absolutely. Amazement at the miracles is appropriate, but it's not enough. It has to lead to submission to his instruction. Matthew guides us away from being mere passive spectators, wowed by the show, towards becoming active learners who take the king's authoritative voice seriously.
Okay, that's the first error. Seeking signs without submission. What's the second error this word deed framing prevents?
The second error is the opposite danger. Moralism, or just seeing Jesus as a good ethical teacher. This is where someone might admire Jesus' teachings, maybe praise the Sermon on the Mount as wonderful ethics, calling him a great religious figure, but they ignore or downplay the divine power and the unique identity that authenticated his person and his mission.
Sort of treating the Sermon on the Mount like a nice set of ideals detached from who Jesus actually is, and maybe dismissing the miracle stories as just, myths or exaggerations from a pre-scientific age.
Yes, exactly. Reducing Jesus to just a moral guide. But Matthew insists, the person making those radical ethical demands, the one saying, "But I say to you," is the very same sovereign Lord who acts with comprehensive divine power. Matthew refuses to let you separate the king's command from the king's power.
So the word isn't just good advice, it's the command of the sovereign Lord, and his deeds prove he has the authority and the power to back it up.
The unity is essential. And this integration of teaching and power also connects to how Christ normally works in his church today, which aligns with the Reformed understanding of the means of grace.
Right, because we don't typically expect Jesus to walk around performing the same kind of instantaneous public healings today. So how does this word and deed unity apply now?
Well, the primacy of teaching, the word coming first, corresponds to the ordinary means of grace that Christ uses to gather and nourish his church throughout history. The public reading and preaching of Scripture, the right administration of the sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, and prayer. These are his established channels for building his kingdom now. The miracles recorded in Matthew, the deeds, they functioned as public seals or attestations during that foundational period. They authenticated the messenger, Jesus, and his message. They confirmed his unique identity and authority. They aren't meant to be the everyday credential of the church now, but the theological truth they revealed, that Christ is sovereign over all creation and all misery. That remains absolutely true and gives us confidence.
So even if we don't chase the specific signs from Matthew 8 and 9, we trust the King who performed them and we rely on the word he gave us, administered through the means he ordained.
That's the balance. And the mutual necessity remains crucial. Think about it. Compassion without the king's news, without the kikigarish and the gospel proclamation, well, it might provide temporary help, but it lacks eternal weight. It just becomes social work. But conversely, proclamation without tangible compassion, without the spirit of therapeuin, of caring for real needs, can easily sound hollow, cold, or hypocritical. Matthew holds word and deed together so that we receive both the truth of his teaching and the tangible reality of his mercy. A full picture of the king requires both.
Okay, so Jesus starts his ministry up in Galilee. Matthew already pointed out this fulfills Isaiah 9, the land of darkness seeing a great light. But doesn't stay local for long, does it? The crowds start pouring in from all over the place. Let's look at just how wide the reach was, even early on, as described in Matthew 4.24-25.
Yeah, the scope explodes almost immediately. It tells you right away this isn't just some small regional movement. Matthew notes that Jesus' fame spread through all Syria. Now, Syria was a huge Roman province to the north of Galilee, and it had a really diverse population: Jews, Greeks, Romans, Arameans, you name it. So the fact that his fame reached all Syria signals that the impact of his work is already crossing the usual ethnic and geographical lines even before he gives the Great Commission.
And then Matthew lists the specific regions where people were coming from to see Jesus. It feels like he's deliberately piling up regions to emphasize just how widespread this attraction was.
He really is. The list is strategically chosen to cover the map, basically. You've got
Home base, Galilee, makes
Right.
sense.
Then the Decapolis. Now, this was a league of about 10 self-governing Greek-influenced cities, mostly east of the Sea of Galilee. And the key thing here, as our sources highlight, is that this represents strongly Gentile-influenced territory. The king isn't just sticking to Jewish areas. His light is already reaching out towards the nations.
Okay, Galilee, the Decapolis, then the religious and political core.
Right. Jerusalem and Judea, this is the Jewish heartland, home of the temple, the center of religious life, and the area under direct Roman administration. So people coming down from the north, Galilee, Syria, and up from the south, Judea.
And the last one mentioned.
The land beyond the Jordan, which refers to the areas east of the Jordan River, often called Perea in other sources, another mixed region. So by listing all these places, Jewish heartland, Hellenized Gentile areas, the northern base, the southern center, the eastern territories, Matthew paints this picture of a massive convergence. People are streaming in from everywhere, a remarkably diverse multitude drawn by this one man.
And this geographical sweep, starting up in Galilee of the nations, it clearly points to something much bigger, doesn't it?
Oh, it's deeply theological. First, as you said, the setting in Galilee fulfills Isaiah 9.1-2, light dawning in the darkness. But second, this diverse crowd, especially with people coming from the Decapolis, it foreshadows the ultimate scope of the kingdom.
It anticipates the Abrahamic promise, doesn't it? That through Abraham's seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed.
Exactly. It sets the stage for later encounters in Matthew, like the Roman centurion's amazing faith in chapter 8, or Jesus dealing with the demoniacs in the Gentile region of the Gadarenes. Matthew is showing us right from the start that the magnetic pull of the king's word and deed has a fundamentally universal trajectory.
And you mentioned earlier that all motif connecting this beginning section to the very end of the gospel.
Yes, it's a beautiful inclusio, structural echo. Here in chapter 4, the king heals every disease, every affliction, 4.23, showing his comprehensive power and compassion. Then at the very end, in chapter 28, verses 18-20, the resurrected Christ declares he has been given all authority. He commissions his disciples to make disciples of all nations, and he promises to be with them all the days. That repetition of all links the beginning of his earthly ministry, his total competence over suffering, to the ultimate scope of his reign and mission. His authority is total, his mission is global, his presence is constant.
Which means when we read the Sermon on the Mount, we shouldn't read it as just some local rules for first-century Galileans. It's the royal law of the Son of David, whose reign is meant for the whole world. The ethics are universal because the king's authority is universal.
That's precisely the implication. The geographical breadth foreshadows the global commission.
Okay, Matthew paints this picture in 4.25. Huge crowds converging from all these different regions, drawn by the teaching, the heralding, the healing. It's dramatic. But then the narrative takes a sharp, deliberate turn. Chapter 5, verse 1. Jesus sees the crowds, goes up on the mountain, and sits down to teach his disciples. What's the significance of that shift? Moving from the spectacle of the masses to focused instruction for learners.
That structural move is incredibly important. It functions like a sift. The crowds, understandably, are drawn by immediate needs, by curiosity, by the sheer wonder of it all. They are, in a large part, spectators. But Jesus, and Matthew guiding the reader, immediately shifts the focus. He moves away from the broad appeal of the miracles towards the specific demands placed on those who would actually follow him. It guides us away from being merely fascinated onlookers toward becoming active learners who submit to the king's voice.
So the wonders might attract the initial attention, but it's the word, the teaching, that defines and retains the true disciple.
That's the critical distinction Matthew is making. Jesus goes up the mountain, another echo of Sinai emphasizing authority, and he directs his teaching specifically to the disciples, those who had already made some commitment to follow. The sermon that follows immediately presses the question. Okay, the miracles are amazing, but who's going to stick around when the excitement fades and only the yoke of the king's teaching remains? Who is willing to actually live this way?
It shows the king is much more concerned with the quality of allegiance than just the size of the crowd, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Huge crowds might look impressive, but they don't necessarily mean genuine kingdom growth if those people aren't willing to actually submit to the king's instruction. Matthew is pastorally very realistic about crowds. They can be amazed, curious, even desperate for help, but still remain fundamentally unchanged and uncommitted to obedience.
And what then is the mark of genuine allegiance according to Matthew here?
Well, the sermon itself concludes by defining it clearly in chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. True allegiance is marked by hearing and doing the king's words. The wise person builds their life on the rock of Christ's teaching, not on the shifting sands of mere emotional response or chasing signs. That's the difference between superficial curiosity and real discipleship.
This has some pretty direct implications for us today, maybe even a warning about how we sometimes measure ministry success.
It certainly does. It cautions against prioritizing ministry metrics that are based only on hype, big numbers, or emotional experiences. The king himself established his rule primarily through instruction. So faithfulness to teaching the whole counsel of God and seeing genuine growth in holiness and obedience in people's lives, that's what carries lasting weight. The king gathers his true subjects through his word, not primarily through spectacle. Moving from the healings in the fields to the teaching on the mountain is a move from wonder to the hard work of righteousness.
Let's circle back one last time to that careful distinction Matthew made back in 4.24 between the demonized, the seizure sufferers, and the paralytics. What are the practical implications for pastoral care today?
Well, that careful categorization is really helpful pastorally. It demands prudence and discernment, guarding against overly simplistic diagnoses or solutions for suffering. It warns us against, automatically assuming every physical or mental struggle is direct demonic attack, or conversely, denying spiritual reality altogether.
Meaning we need both faith and wisdom.
Exactly. We need wisdom to discern the nature of the struggle. The church is called to pray earnestly for the sick. Absolutely. As James 5 tells us, we should expect God to act. But we are also called to use the good gifts of God found in sound medicine, therapy, counsel, and practical care where they're appropriate. The king's power is ultimate, and he can intervene directly and miraculously, but we also submit to his wisdom when he chooses to sustain us through weakness, perhaps like he did with Paul's thorn in the flesh, rather than removing it immediately. His timing and methods are his own, but his sufficiency, demonstrated in Matthew 4, covers every category of human misery. We trust him whether he heals now or sustains us until the final restoration.
So the picture Matthew paints right at the start of Jesus' public ministry is one of perfect balance. Unwavering commitment to the authority and truth of the word, combined with deep, active, tangible compassion for people suffering in every way, spiritually, mentally, physically.
And that compassion flows from who he is. Matthew later explicitly connects Jesus' actions to his heart, saying he saw the crowds and had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. So this whole section, Matthew 4.2325, really serves as a call to follow Jesus, moving from initial wonder to committed obedience, from being part of the crowd to becoming a disciple, recognizing the King who both commands righteousness and cares deeply for the broken. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Well, really digging into this programmatic snapshot in Matthew 4 has been incredibly helpful. You see how Matthew uses verses 23 through 25 almost like a compass for reading the next 5 chapters. It forces you, the reader, to see Jesus as both the authoritative lawgiver, the word has primacy, and the compassionate Lord, the deed confirms his identity and his message. And keeping that integration is vital, isn't it? It stops us from splitting doctrine from mercy or separating his authority from his compassion. We have to take the King's whole counsel, understanding his high standards and his sovereign, sufficient care for us in our brokenness.
Right. And maybe a final thought to leave with you is looking forward, connecting this foundational work of Jesus in Galilee to the end goal, the consummation of his kingdom. Those healings he performed, reversing paralysis, bringing peace to troubled minds, casting out demons David describes as the first rays of the world to come. They were clear signs that God's future reign was breaking into the present. So if Christ's word and his power already addressed the full range of human brokenness, spiritual darkness, mental anguish, physical decay, right there in the villages of Galilee, just imagine what the King's final restoration will look like when he returns, when he wipes away every tear and makes all things new. What aspect of human suffering, maybe one Matthew specifically cataloged, are you most eagerly anticipating seeing Christ reverse completely when his reign is fully and finally realized?
That guarantee is powerful, isn't it? That the same King who commanded righteousness is the one who ultimately cures all affliction. It gives tremendous hope for that final day. Thank you for joining us for this deep look into Matthew's Gospel. We look forward to sitting down with you again for our next dive into Scripture here on Reformed Thinking.